Mel Jordan is an artist. She's professor in art and the public sphere at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University. And until recently, she was head of contemporary art practices at the Royal College of Art, London. Jordan was part of the Free Art Collective from 2005 to 2018. In 2018, Jordan with Hewitt formed the Partisan Social Club, a provisional group including artists, designers, and researchers. Recent projects include After Thompson at Coventry Biennial, Social Montage at Edinburgh Print Workshop, and Being Together, memberships, collectives, and unions at Beaconsfield Gallery in London. As part of the Free Art Collective, Jordan exhibited widely, most notably at the 13th Istanbul Biennial, at the Bach, Utrecht, and the Liverpool Biennial in Liverpool. Thank you so much, Mel, for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. Sorry, it's always talking into a void, isn't it? Well, thank you. Nice to sort of see everybody. And thank you. Thanks to Carolina and Anthony for inviting me here today and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts on practice research. And as Carolina said, I'm an artist and professor of art in the public sphere in the Centre for Post-Digital Practices at Coventry University. And I have a PhD by publication and practice. So just a little bit about me. And although I'm interested in the potential of the public sphere as a way to change opinion and produce a better way to live together, I'm also concerned with its troublesome nature. I'm currently working on a special issue of the Art and the Public Sphere journal entitled Monumental Statues, History and Emancipation, in which I'm considering what the Black Lives Movement teaches the theory of the bourgeois public sphere. And here today, I'm interested to inquire into what ways practice research can help destabilize rational thought and reasoned argument, which, as we know, is foregrounded in some versions of the public sphere theory. So I'm going to talk about practice research, some of its characteristics. I'm going to show a few examples of PhD work, and then I wanted us to try and experiment. And I don't know how this is going to go, but let's see how we go. And it would have been different if we'd all been together, but we'll try. Yes, I want us to experiment with how we might articulate practice research by taking a quick look at an interview by Stefan Schukowitz and Stefano Harney and Fred Morton as part of the Undercommons book, just to enjoy the way they talk positively and informally about learning, study and collaboration. Yeah, not sure how much time we'll have for that, but I think it's something to look at together. So I'm just going to quickly introduce some sort of history of rational thought and the public sphere. The Academy has endorsed and foreground versions of rational knowledge since the Enlightenment. The duality between reason and affect was endorsed by Kant, who saw reason as a process that would advance general understandings of virtue, ethics, and morality. Kant was suspicious of affect as he thought it disrupted the normal process of choice, leading to actions based solely on feeling. For Kant, affect rapidly grows to a degree of feeling which makes reflection impossible. Thus, he regarded it as thoughtless. Thereby, he distanced the cognitive from the emotional. Hobbes emphasizes the connection between reason and knowledge, but he does concede that nothing can ever be fully understood just with reason. We need the presence of sense and memory to cognize. Locke and Hume pursue the connection between research and knowledge, with Locke proposing a symbiotic relationship between reason and the passions, and Hume defining reason as an instinctive response rather than a process. We could maybe forgive this dismissal of affect by Enlightenment thinkers during the development of the public sphere. Perhaps we could say that these philosophers were trying to break down the influence that the church and the monarchy had on the people, which they perceived to have been achieved by affective means. For them, beliefs had to be based on demonstrable knowledge to enable a liberal society to emerge, one independent from God and King. Although Western philosophical thought does not necessarily dismiss affective states as meaningless, the consequence of this separation of reason and affect shaped the tendency to associate rationality with knowledge making and science. So what I'm trying to get at here is that I think that we still understand knowledge in the making of research in the same way, and this has an impact on how we consider practice research. So my thinking differently about knowledge affects things that we do. This is still the dominant way in which structures of research within the academy or research councils, research exercise framework, are based on. And there's a dominant ideology of thought that normalizes such adages as think with your brain, act with your heart, listen to your head, follow your gut. These expressions support the view that these two ways of thinking are opposite extremes of the same continuum. We know that Eastern philosophy, by contrast, views emotion and rationality as a potentially opposable but ultimately reconcilable states. And work has been done on this. Shigworth and Gregg's 2010 book, The Affect Theory Reader, which includes the work of Sarah Ahmed and Brian Masumi, and situates affect in relation to media theory. And more recently, Answorth and Bell's article in which they discuss affected pedagogy versus affective knowledge. Nowadays, even Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines affect as a noun, the conscious emotion that occurs in reaction to thought or experience. And Zizi Papacharisi, in her 2015 book on affective public, says, quote, "What reason, belief, and ideology suggest, affect, feeling, and emotion frequently overturn in favor of the irrational. Yet affect, feeling, and emotion also reflexively drive movements that express rationally focused expressions of ideological beliefs. Therefore, affect is central to the way we form values and opinions in order to make, contribute, and understand the world." So what I'm getting at here is if we accept affect as a way of thinking and receiving knowledge, responding to a situation, and as a crucial part of how we comprehend circumstances in the world, how we arrive at decisions, etc., then we can say that affective processes are part of how we learn and therefore must be part of how we do research. So I quickly took us through, rather briefly, two aspects of cognition and how they've been estranged, and suggested this is particularly tricky for those of us working within the area of practice research, although I generally think it's a bigger problem for all. Knowing again and again in the same way might in fact be the major drawback to rethinking the way we live together. The Enlightenment's engagement with scientific understanding mapped onto technological and economic progress through modernity has maybe led to the stuckness of liberal democracy. The way we are taught to think and learn might be holding us back from thinking and learning differently. What happens if reasoned, rational thinking might only lead us to advance capitalism and neoliberalism? So there's, I think, to explore this, there's so much more at stake than defining practice research for our own means. For practitioners, effective thinking is always part of the process of making an object or conceiving of a materially based immaterial response to a set of circumstances. I'm trying to sort of say that to suggest that not all practice-based work results in an object, but in materially based immaterial responses. Perhaps in art and design subject, it is and it has been more difficult to separate reason from affect, whereas I'm convinced that the combination of affect and reason is a closer explanation to the way we think and learn. Affect has always been foregrounded and normalized in the arts through practical outcome practice. And again, I'm sort of mucking around with words there because I understand that writing is a practice, other things are a practice, but here I mean practical outcomes as practice. So my objective today has been to consider the ways in which knowledge and thereby knowledge-making practices are understood by the institutions of research. So I will depart from what we might understand to be artistic research, research carried out by artists as part of the production of artworks, and I will continue with an exploration of the infrastructural context of research, namely the way in which the academy understands practice research. And here I will use the term practice-led, although having listened to Michael, I might stop using that term. I think it is more specifically fits to how I see artists working within the remit of practice research today within the institution. Just one of the norms that we have to deal with, I suppose, so I've taken that. There are ongoing debates about what is considered practice research within art, although there's no real consensus beyond the field. However, Biggs and Carlson put forward one of the most comprehensive definitions of it as research. That is, quote, embedded in artistic and academic contexts and seeks to convey and communicate content that is enclosed in aesthetic experiences, enacted in creative practices and embodied in artistic products. Eva Livia defines it as research conducted by artists who research within and through the arts. Artistic methodologies are applied and the end result is presented in the way that is best suited for the content and theme of the project. We also have to acknowledge that although practice research in art is conducted primarily through the medium of practice, it is situated at the confluence of practice, theory, and history, and requires the practitioner researcher is fluent in all these fields. There is some disagreement as to whether the artwork is the ultimate goal of practice-led research, or whether it is the knowledge, insight, know-how produced through and during the research process. It can be argued, however, that the practitioner researcher embraces an ideology that recognizes that research is valuable both as a form of standalone and conceptual academic knowledge and a tacit non-conceptual knowledge that feeds back into and furthers practice. And I don't know if there's any, I'm hoping that there's some PhD students in the room that will have been sort of grappling with some of those processes of where is the research in their project, and where is the practice, and finding that maybe some parts of it are doing a number of things. Another point of contention is whether practice-led research should seek to give verbal expression to the non-conceptual knowledge it may produce. For Candy, rational, scholarly, linguistic description of the creative process that verbalizes the non-conceptual content of practice is desirable. Biggs and Carlson hold that such an explication is neither desirable nor always possible, and that it risks shrinking the program into a sort of decoding exercise, something that many of us would experience when we're sort of writing and making alongside each other. We don't necessarily want the written element of our research to be a decoding of the practice element, where the artworks and the practice become secondary to their verbal interpretations. They offer other non-verbal alternatives, which include argumentation that is coded in videos, scripts, diagrams, or notebooks. Stephen Scrivener goes further and calls for a more nuanced understanding of research to be applied to visual art, one that fully acknowledges the differences between the objectives of the art practice and academic research. In particular, he calls for artistic research to be fully cognizant of its own disciplinary goals and to negotiate its own terms of engagement with the academic research field. Scrivener proposes that an ideal scenario for many practice-led researchers is for the making process to be understood as a form of research and the art object as a form of knowledge. He refutes the position that knowledge is produced through the making process, as this effectively designates the art object as a byproduct of the research process. While we see within the art school, there are many agreements as well as nuanced disagreements what is acceptable and useful for the understanding of the value of practice research, This approach to knowledge making suffers when advice is given by those inexperienced or unassociated with the discipline. The lack of appreciation of the value of practice research can have a deleterious impact upon the direction of a PhD study, and no doubt influences the way Research Council funding is currently distributed. However, there is more at stake than particular disciplines missing out on the cash and the credit. As I said earlier, I think the bigger question is, how can the recognition and adoption of effective forms of learning and knowing impact the way we produce the world together? So why is practice research not easily received? There's a number of reasons that practice-led research is difficult to follow and therefore difficult to translate to other disciplines. And I've made a list. Practice-led research charts a different course to the other forms of academic research, insofar as it's sometimes not possible to articulate research questions and problems at the beginning. They are prone to shifting and changing. It tends to be discovery-led as opposed to hypothesis-led, prompted by hunches and intuitions, as well as tacit understandings and practical knowledge and experience. There is no one method to comprehend, and this is probably one of my main, we can't have a methodology in the same way, I think. Methods and methodologies of research are invented each time a researcher makes a project. And this is because of the contingent nature of art and design, which works concurrently with the world and is thwarted or facilitated by the contingent nature of making immaterial material things. So therefore, because of it as a subject, we can never use an applied methodology. We almost, we customize every time, and we create our own methodology. And that's why one of the things that we contribute in general is a new methodology, and probably something that we sometimes fail to realize. The method and the outcome might be the same object. There are a number of ways that the research and the way in which it is carried out overlap and fold back on itself. And it's very difficult for us to pull out aspects of the research in a sort of programmatic way, because a method is sometimes a logic for the making of an artwork, and it's sometimes the way you make it too. So it's continually entangled. The epistemological stance of the practice-led researcher is that they are both the subject and the object of the research. So that's another thing that's difficult for us. As a result of this insider perspective, self-reflexivity is of the central importance to practice-led research. It is necessary for the practitioner researcher to also be a self-observer. However, as Gray and Mallins note, the knowledge produced through practice-led research is intersubjective, context-bound, and is a result of a personal construction. Makes it difficult to translate. Reality creation. It can result in entirely new formats for art and design, where scientific research simply, at the moment, although I have to reconsider this again, listening to Michael, simply reproduces a familiar version of reality. The ability of the practitioner researcher to imagine reality other than it is. Moreover, while philosophy shares this imagining of things differently, it remains in a theoretical, hypothetical, it remains in general in a theoretical and hypothetical form, whereas the practitioner researcher puts it into practice. They seek to make the impossible possible. Right, now I'm going to seek to make something the possible impossible, because I'm going to try and share my screen. I suppose I was talking abstractly about rational and effective knowledge, and then I was talking about the discussions and disagreements and nuances and the discourse around what constitutes practice research. So I sort of wanted to talk about some concrete examples now. And to sort of give you an idea about how what I've just said looks in terms of a PhD thesis. So my student, Adam Walker, recently completed his PhD at the RCA entitled Ways of Being Beyond the Perpetuating Inequalities of the Technosphere, Textual Artistic Intervention as a Vital Strategy in Enabling Resistant Agency. In order to address issues that arose through his engagement with his practice, Walker arrives at a type of argumentation through what he calls lexis and praxis, and constructs these two positions not to be dialectical, but rather to engage with each other. This is an extract from his abstract. He says, quote, "This thesis comprises an interwoven, overlapping body of artistic interventions and multiple forms of writing. In reflexive engagement, these elements develop an ethical, political, and methodological approach of radical care. The thesis' primary original contribution to knowledge, radical care, is an approach to artistic practice, and more holistically, a way of being as interrelationally human, who is disruptive, subversive, resistant, and resilient to the technosphere. Artistic interventions which operate disobediently within the textual, according to an ethics of radical care, hold the potential to disrupt the technospheric status, which is otherwise continually represented." This thesis proceeds through three intersecting parts. Part one, addresses the question, how does the technosphere use dehumanizing abstraction to gain agency over labor, the body, the artist, and the future? Part two, bodies, asks, how does technospheric abstraction manifest in differentiation, material inequalities as the pivotal sites of the collective political body and specific human bodies? A connection is drawn between the public sphere as a subsumed site through which the technosphere reproduces itself and physical human bodies at which violence and exploitation is enacted. Part three, care, considers what might constitute a way of being which can operate through a would-be totalizing hegemony, but is not premised on either that hegemonic or any alternative hierarchical structure through which resistant equality might form. It represents a Lucretian ontology through which we might think rethink both the technosphere and the artistic intervention non-dialectically, and out of which a multifaceted concept of care is developed as a key to resistant, resilient, counter-hegemonic practice and being. Radical care holds timely contemporary relevance as opaque, unequal, and proprietarial structures increasingly affect the lives we lead or might imagine. This thesis presents this as an addition to existent discourses of care, and specifically develops an approach by which critical art might be politically affective within this. In so doing, it holds open a way of thinking more caringly, co-equal ways of being, something urgently needed in our present reality. So I just showed that slide because there's a lot of diagrams that are very useful to show the way that things interact and overlay and refold and entangle with each other. And I've just got another couple of examples. Marina Hadjulica, who has recently completed her PhD, on the other hand, she utilizes the contingent nature of her project in the public realm to create a practice-based method to understanding if the practice of performance design can be used towards triggering active coexistence in contested spaces. The site of her research is the south-walled city of Nicosia in Cyprus. The investigation aims to find tools for the performance designer to play an active political role. To achieve this, the research draws from social art practice. By investigating the role of the performance designer as trigger, the research contributes towards the expanding field of scenography and seeks to establish the contribution of the field towards socially engaged practices. So in her work, she's sort of mashing things up, and this happens quite a lot within PhD projects and practice research, because as artists, we're drawing from so many fields, and what can be a contribution to knowledge is a sort of mash up of fields or new ways of putting things together, a sort of montage. So agency of objects, agency of movement of bodies, agency of space, agency of the materiality. Through this practice, performance design is taken outside the theatre and those orthodoxies and applied as a methodology into the urban site. This process allows the investigation to expand and problematize on the notion of site specificity. Hadjulica's research benefited again from the use of diagrams, which helped map the overlapping aspects of her work and helped her include the interventions she made, as well as the site, social and political context. It's really complicated when you're making an artwork. It has a number of, as we all know, it has a number of considerations to bear in mind, some of them extremely complicated. And this enabled her to include the local politics and acknowledge the range of stakeholders that she was working with, from passerby of the space she investigated to local cafe owners and civic representatives. I'll just put that in because I just think, here I am sort of thinking about how diagrams are really useful because of this interconnectedness of our work. So I'm going to stop sharing. And just one more example, which is a very, very different, and I just wanted to include this, is a student who hasn't quite finished yet, Marina Hadjulica, and her project is entitled Open Form, Reimagining the Queer Body Through Contemporary Performance. And the practice outcomes in Maria's project are very slight and almost invisible. And Maria aligns the uprootedness of queerness with the contingencies in a bodily performance practice. Through the artworks, a writing of the works, sorry, I'm getting left now, and her contextualization of the literature, in her inquiry, she asks, how can queerness, also continue to become unknown to itself? How can it juggle both visibility and resistance? She uses text to document her interventions, which include following subjects, using stand-ins and responding to bodily encounters during the making of performance work by others. And I just wanted to include her because her work is very slight and understated. It's been interesting to see how she can navigate that as practice. I think if you're producing objects, you can refer to sort of tacit knowledge within the production. But if you're making slight performances, how do you communicate the process of development? When describing one particular artwork entitled Swayomazadon Magazine, she says, it's a performance in which I ask a man I'd recently met to occupy an exhibition space during the evening of a group show. I had seen him while walking in London and followed him because he resembled an ideal image of myself. We briefly spoke. I asked if he would participate in a performance and he agreed. On the evening of the show, I gave him a magazine to read for its duration. He spent most of the time on the floor. The show took place in a large repurposed chapel in South London. The magazine and the exhibition space mediated our interaction, allowing me to reflect on my relationship with him as someone I could not be. So these three examples are very different in types of topics and contexts, and all use practice in different ways. And I just wanted to talk concretely about even a little insight into these projects, and in case that might be helpful, and to also explain how complex thinking about practice research is. So I finished my sort of full-on spiel. And I wanted to turn to the rest of the session, and I wanted to pose two questions for us to consider going forward in terms of practice research, or our definitions of it, our engagement with it, our use of it, what it means to us and the world. So one question is, how might one go about articulating a discipline-specific research vocabulary that doesn't kowtow the radical alterity of practice-led research? So how possible is it to start to make definitions that we don't want to make definitions on the one hand because we don't want to close it down, but we do need some definitions, otherwise we mystify it all the time and are unable to communicate it. And also if we're unable to communicate it, we're unable to say what its potentials are and how important it is. So that's one thing to think about. And secondly, how can practice-led research act as a source of visionary power and as a forum for radically democratic debate? And okay, that's me being thinking that maybe there's one chance of changing the world through practice-led research, but how can it? If part of it is about imagining the world differently, how can we make that work more effectively? How can we imagine more worlds differently? So in order to muck around with these questions, I wanted just to experiment with reading Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's interview with Stefan Shoukaitis, entitled The General Antagonism, from their book, The Undercommons. I wondered if we could gather any ideas, phrases, examples of vocabulary that they use that resonate with ways of thinking used in our and your individual practices. I suppose my feeling is that we might activate more words that help us describe the practice research process. I understand that what they are talking about in general is collaboration, but I was still struck by some of the things they described, some of the ways they described the process of collaborating and how it reminded me of making practice within the world. And I think the way they reconfigure ideas of study resonate with thinking about making knowledge in new ways through practice research. They suggest that what they call the undercommons is all around us, that it is already happening, but it is also transgressing the boundaries of academic discourse. These acts of rhetorical breaching, stealing and smuggling make commons, but they also raise political and social questions. Maybe I'm just always on the lookout of ways for doing different ways of doing things that I can relate to, that relates to practice research. So I didn't know, I'd hoped that this part of the session, we could maybe look at that interview and think about how it resonates with our practice. And I wanted to sort of open it up a bit more. I've had my half an hour, so it would be great to hear your thoughts. I don't know if anyone's managed to read it or they've read it before, or they've got anything to say about it. Anyone want to start? Anyone got anything to say? Maybe you haven't read it.
I haven't read it.
Oh, great. Thanks for honesty. Yeah, sorry, it's probably a bit hopeful when you put it on the end to read. Maybe I could talk a bit about it just quickly then, and maybe it might be, and I can tell you why I think it might be useful, and it may be something that you can read afterwards if it helps. And then maybe we could open up to more. I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts as well in this time, rather than just talk at you. This what this was we were supposed to be doing if we'd have been in real life. So okay, I thought the response to the first question that Shoukaitis asked about keeping a shoebox and collecting ideas was very interesting. And here I'll open up my version of it. Stephen Shoukaitis asked them, if you were to introduce someone to your collaborative work through the form of a conceptual shoebox, what would it be in, and what would it be, and what would be in there? And it's a very, I just thought it was very interesting, because Fred Moten talks about carrying around notebooks, ones that he never reads. It's the writing down that seems important, not the collecting it. It occurred to me that collecting is associated with research in this way. That's why I sort of thought, oh yeah, that's interesting, because the idea that we collect things and then we have this one way of collecting them. So collecting data, collecting ideas, collecting theories. I thought what they were saying and the way they respond to it, as if the important thing is not the information, but the noting of the information. And I wondered if that was something, because as practice researchers, we don't sort of collect things in the same way. We don't collect data in the same way, but we want to know them. And they also talk about not needing a shoebox to put this collection in, but the process of collaboration somehow stands in for a point of collection. And I thought about this as well. I was thinking, well, with practice research, it seems that you're collaborating with the world all the time. And and that stands in for a private collection of things that stay in a shoebox, but more about the way you put this information back into the world and you wrangle with it. And what I'm trying to say is that the content of the box is less important for me than the ongoing process of talking with someone else and the ideas that emerge. And Fred Morton talks about thinking with others, and that there are some things that don't go away. You keep revisiting them, and they have, it's almost the same thing that you're having a go at again. And I think research is like that, and practice research is like that a bit. It's not like you resolve it and then move on to another topic. And I think this probably what makes it difficult for postdoc work, for practice research, because you've part of your PhD and part of your practice is about positioning yourself in a particular place, and setting up a series of questions that you might just want to keep having a go at. You know, they might not be resolved through the PhD, but they might be they come back again and again in a different way. And I suppose I was thinking about that my interest with the public sphere, because of its relationship to politics and publishing, I still stick with it, but it gets reinvented again when I think about the context of the world. You know, so like I said at the beginning, what Black Lives Matter makes us, you know, what does that do to the bourgeois public sphere? What does practice research do to the history of enlightenment and rational thinking, to rethink what the same troubles that I had in the beginning. And Fred Morton says, it feels more like there are one or two things that I've been talking about with people forever, and the conversation develops over the course of time. And you think of new things and you say new things, but the ideas that are stuck in my head are usually the things that somebody else said. So, and Harney says, I'm a person who doesn't make notes on what I've read, because I just know I'm not going to go back to them. I'm not a collector in that way. It's the same thing, I think, in the building of any kind of partnership or collectivity. It's not the thing that you do, it's the thing that happens while you're doing it that becomes important. So I just thought some of these things resonated with practice research.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking on everything that you're talking about, everything that you're reading, putting things in a box. It's almost like things through the process of our lifetime, keeping a journal, keeping our thoughts, conversations. It's almost like a through line of our work and what connects the work throughout our personal history. Do you understand?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I was trying to sort of think about it so practice research isn't a project in the way, it's not a research project, it's a positioning, it's a set of understandings. It's it doesn't end, it just gets reconfigured, and you know, you have another go at it, and that you find that there's a similar concerns are the same. And I think it's just the way that Harney and Morton speak about this in this interview in such a sort of informal way that is very different from maybe the formal language that we meet when we're doing research, whether we're doing a PhD or whether we're working with research councils or whatever. It feels like a freeing of the way that we might even talk about it. And so I was thinking those definitions are maybe what we need. We need these informal, fluid definitions, not definitions that formalize us and restrict us, but fluid definitions that we can that we can utilize in a way that doesn't sort of constrict what we're doing. And also the fact that we use them informally is politics itself. So we almost, you know, take on the role of that's what I think so political about reading Morton and Harney, is that the informal way in which you feel like you know them as you're reading through, or you think, yeah, you know, that's something that me and my mate talked about. That is a politics itself. And because they're interested in study and learning anyway, they're always trying to flatten understandings. So I think that's why I wanted just to look at it, because I think it brings a very different prospect to so I'm trying to say we don't want to get into defining it in a programmatic, systematic way, because that won't be helpful. So I don't know if someone else got a question there. Harriet's got a question.
Hi, yeah, thank you for everything you said so far. It's been fascinating. I too haven't seen that interview. I didn't realise about that, but I had actually read about Morton before, because I looked up about collaboration when I started a collaborative project. And I know that we kind of maybe don't want to deviate into collaboration, but it's really helped me think through practice-based research, as I have been saying, which I now again will have to address after what Michael was talking about earlier. But Morton led me on to Rachel Lehrman. I don't know if you've read some of her. I think it was in her doctoral thesis, actually. She talks about the phantom limb that happens during a collaborative project. And when I worked with my colleague on a printmaking project and we examined collaboration, we were examining the processes of two people acting performatively with a printmaking process, and the phantom limb became to us imbricated with the idea of a material third or a visual voice. And to me, this point resonated particularly in the sense that for the first time ever, I hadn't written anything down about this, and it was only when we began to kind of publicize it with conferences and webinars that the project really came back to life. It was living for the couple of days that we did this research process, and then it kind of died, and not because of the global pandemic necessarily, because it was not attuned to. But when we started talking about it, it began to develop and it began to change and it began to evolve. And to pick up on what you said about things, and I think Dawn was talking about something moving kind of fluidly through conversation, I just wonder whether practice and kind of socially as well could be considered something like a temporal thing, that it just never really can stick. And if it does stick, is that kind of problematic in the sense that if it's written down, it's instantly archaic, it's instantly backdated. You know, I really haven't read anything I've published because I really don't want to see it and I don't want to read what I've written. But is this reflecting back to what Michael said perhaps about, I think he said there are no metaphysical frameworks anymore, and I was too nervous to ask him about that, but I wondered whether that's something that is kind of imbricated in this conversation. I'm sorry, it's not really a question, it's more a verbal.
Well, I think it's interesting that Michael was talking about publishing, and you've just brought that up as well, this moment where things come together in a different set of, you know, contingency and different orders and different hierarchies in the point of publishing. And, you know, he obviously uses Duchamp as a sort of, I don't mean to talk for Michael, but, you know, he uses Duchamp as a sort of way of the realization, if you like, of that moment. Because what is always left out of, I think, as well, is the social relations of that moment. So there's the publishing of it, but there's the sort of whole intervention and the sociality of the way that Duchamp makes that happen, and then the publishing. So we've got, so I would even add to the publishing the social relations contingent, and then the publishing contingent, and then it changes again. So it's really hard to, think about one thing being a result of the other. It just is in this temporal time, and that's why I think maybe practitioners keep with some of the same preoccupations and revisit them again and again in a different time, in a different way. And so it's just a continual, which I think is different to other research practices. Thank you. Is there any other questions? Oh, Carolina's got a question. Oh, great, thank you.
Yes, I think it's more, it's probably also a comment. I'll join Harriet on that, I think, as well. But I mean, Mel, thank you so much for the very, I think, very structured as well argument of what's happening with research and what might be kind of the challenges there, especially when it tends to be seen as part of the same logics and protocols of research in general. And so what are the difficulties that we face when we need to identify, you know, things that might seem very simple, such as methodology, research question, etc. So I think there's something quite incredibly important, and I'm thinking of the PGRs in the room, really, of when one needs to identify what is the methodology. And you mentioned that at some point. You said that eventually there are as many methodologies in practice research as there are research projects specifically. So meaning that what we have in hands is also the fact that the research question and the urgency, I would say, is actually the one that is enabling the identification of how we are going to go about something. Which is kind of quite different from other disciplines. And sometimes that's difficult also for us to convey, precisely because instead of having a pool of possibilities, we have to, in a way, sort of invent or put together a structure that enables us to develop what we are doing. And I think that's very much thanks to also the traditions, I think, in legacies in the field, and the way that I'm thinking now here in terms of more artistic practices and curatorial practices, how their nature is also of questioning and also trying to understand the very mechanisms that produce what we call reality or regimes of truth. So in a way, it's a kind of a continuation of that process, I would say. But I wanted to ask you, but also probably even if there's someone in the room who have come across this difficulty, which is how to identify the methodology and how do we understand clearly the role of practice that is not illustrating the theory, that is not sitting at the end of the process. So what is this role throughout that we have to be also able to argue, I think, with a lot of confidence that sometimes we might miss here and there. So it's kind of a question, it's a twofold question around kind of the role of practice, but also the methodologies, and maybe to hear from people in the room if they've come across kind of these questions and thought about them as being kind of actually quite tricky, and if we can eventually kind of try to understand how people have experienced this.
Could I just add a little bit, Carolina? That's really important and a really important thing to bring up and to discuss, I think, and to open out. I think there is something between the difference between a method and a methodology that sometimes gets collapsed, and other areas have sort of the use of one type of methodology, and it's sort of a pretty programmatic structure to a PhD. I'm always really interested in thinking about the design of a PhD, how you what bits of it fit where, and how's it going to sort of work, and the reason I do that, I think, is because we don't have these reliable or relied on methodologies. I don't think we should, but what we should maybe foreground more is the way that we maybe design our projects in relation to our study, because I think we tend to use argumentation. So we are critical, we have humanities, we tend to use a bit of social science methods as well, because we're practical, we're in the world, and then of course we make things, however slight they are, from me talking about Maria's work to to fully blown sculptural projects within practice research. So I think that there is something there that we're missing a bit in terms of sort of supporting or in terms of articulating the study. The other thing I was going to say, and I agree with you, is this idea of being really confident about what we do. And sometimes I get upset when I think that there's maybe not enough knowledge around to allow that confidence to sort of happen. And so people are sort of forced into different situations, which I don't think that they necessarily have to be. So thank you, but I'd like to hear from other people now.
There's a question here from Juan, I think. And Joe, am I right to say that you also have a question? Yeah, okay. So there's three. I think Hannah now is also raised her hand. So we have 5 minutes or so. So maybe what we could do is just to hear Juan, Hannah, and Joe and see where it takes us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel, and thank you, Carolina. Very inspiring and a lot of ideas. I have 4 points. I will try to articulate them because they are very dense and they belong also to my starting research project, which you and Carolina knows very well. One is the question. I'm more familiar with, let's say, the continental question of research, or practice research, what is being the debate in Belgium and in Holland. And I always feel that the question is always shifting from the academic into the practice of, in this specific case, arts. So from that, I would like to bring the question of if you could tell what are the differences between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, because in my own understanding, interdisciplinary is expanding. So you, as a practitioner, you go to another field and then you expand your field. But I'm more interested in the transdisciplinary approach, which is a transformative, sort of performative character, where from within your own practice, you go to other fields and then you transform in ways of knowledge production. So this is one of the points. The other point is, for sure you're familiar with Danica Vestlin at the PhD practice in and through arts at the Leiden University. She's been bringing up these questions of practice-based as in arts, as if it, from where the question is coming from inside the academia, or is coming from and through the practice of the practitioners in arts. And she make a very clear difference what means to research in art and to research in and through, to research within and through arts, which is more what I sense is what is the discussion going around. And that deals with a question she's always coming back and referring is how artists think, how we think in creativity, and how is our minds, what are the grammar we use, the tools we use. So basically she positioned the question not within the academia, but outside the academia, like in the practice base of artistic practices. And the third thing is it deals to me into the notion of, because it's a very interesting, this thinking with the other in terms of we as researchers, we are individuals that we approach subjects which are external. But what happens with the trans individual in terms of communality or commons, the common knowledge, and how we create strategies that allows that the research became a trans-individual practice, and how actually, and this is to me the struggling part, how you include that into the academics in terms of evaluating a PhD, a research. So I would like to bring that question. Yeah, it's basically that, and because to me that is also very clear when you from the individual creating knowledge, which is a sort of the academic knowledge, you have a very specific field where are you contributing, but when you're thinking with others, then you address audiences and they also kind of feed back into your research, and that part for me is how you is the part of creating methodologies that allows communities, allows external voices to come into your research, but also to present your research to a very specific I wouldn't say audiences, but to open up your research to a discussion outside the academia. So more or less, those are my concerns. Thank you. Yeah.
Hannah, are you still there?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Mine's just a reflection, really. Thank you, Mel. It's really interesting and insightful and sort of inspiring at the same time. The way, just briefly, that I feel like as I begin my journey into this PhD and try to navigate the waters of how to construct a methodology around my research, I would sort of describe it as having one strong arm, which is my practice, that I kind of feel very confident with, and then the sort of bringing the theory and the context together is the sort of the weaker arm, so swimming around in slight circles, but sort of moving forward, but kind of curling back on myself. And this sort of what kind of interests me was this informal way of dealing with research. So you reading and picking up things that are intriguing and playing a part of what you're understanding, but then what you do with that information formally is maybe where I'm finding a slippage. That's just my reflection.
Yeah, I think just to go back to Adam's example when he goes from Lexis to Praxis, and then Maria's example of not really photographing the work but using writing to describe the work. She was going through loads of, what have I got? I haven't really got much of stuff, and so she started writing, and we thought, God, the writing's really good. It's much closer to the work. So that's what I mean about designing it. It's like, where are you going to fit knowledge in, and how are you going to fit that knowledge in? And yeah, like Adam's Lexis Praxis meant that you had 2 documents. A lot of my students have been having 2 parts. Yeah.
Mel, shall we hear Joe?
Oh yes.
Sorry, Joe, I know you're waiting. Just your hand is not up, so it's a bit more difficult for us to see in the screen, but sorry about that.
Right. Yeah, thank you. There were a few things that you said that really made me think, Mel, and one of them was about methodology, and it was that like each person really has to actually make up their own methodology in art practice, and I think that's really important, that there isn't actually one methodology for the discipline. It's very linked to also the person's ideas. My PhD was on the experience of breaking, but I ended up creating a methodology of breaking. So the chapter that would have been on the methodology actually just got lost because it got swapped so many times round into the main text and back again. And I had a similar friend who's actually at the RCA, Catherine Dormer. Hers was on weaving, and she ended up actually using a methodology of weaving as well as the subject. And it was quite interesting with the pair of us working alongside doing our PhDs. To look at how that happens. And I think the other thing that you're showing all the time as well is that there's diagrams. As artists, there is actually a slightly different way of working, which isn't necessarily about all of the facts and things. It's something to do with acknowledging complexity. You keep working with the same material because you're trying to almost like put that complexity into different understandable structures. And I looked a lot at like theory on dyslexia as well, because it offers quite different formats for thinking than normal ones. And there's a lot of things about looping round the same information, because like quite frequently people with dyslexia are trying to understand complexity rather than actually limit it to something. So it kind of tends to be a weaving in and out, which I think is something similar. And I mean, with my research, I don't go on to a new thing. I can continually break it up, reconfigure it, add new things and new perceptions and redo it. And I think there is a characteristic of that, something to do more with connections and structures and complexity than there is with necessarily one trajectory and moving on. So yeah, so thank you. It made me really rethink what I've been doing.
Oh, thank you. It sounds like you've been doing those things anyway. Like I think we are. It's about giving ourselves permission, I think, to sort of work like that. And I think, yeah, the whole sort of entangled backwards and forwards, like you said, and it, I suppose, with the PhD, what it makes you do is you have to think when you're going to stop. When you're going to start, when you're going to stop, you know, because obviously your life's going to go on forever. Well, let's hope. So I think that's quite difficult as well, to think, well, this is just a little small bit of stuff that I'm going to share formally, properly, you know, in the best, and I'm going to work out how to communicate that in the best way I can, and give that over. I'm not, you know, I'm not going to stop doing it. I'm just going to package it up like this, and that's what I think we should think more about a PhD, not, you know, not to mystify it, but to sort of, you know, to really understand it practically. Thank you. That was great.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just aware of time, Mel. So it's now 5 minutes past the initial time for the workshop. But I just wanted to, before we leave, just to really again thank you for the fantastic presentation and for talking us through some of the hurdles and complications, but also the ways in which we can approach practice research and be able to again raise our confidence in terms of how we are going to go about this moving forward. So thank you again. A lot of questions also came from the participants that I'm sure we are going to take to the afternoon session. And so I think for me, for now, is just to invite you to join us at 2 p.m. for Emily Pringle's keynote. And this is by joining the link, the main room. So not the workshop link, but the general one you have for the symposium. So thank you again and see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.